Africa is experiencing an epidemic of monetized and commercialized elective politics, which is a threat multiplier of democratic backsliding. Unregulated money in elections is further raising the stakes and turning electoral races into violent political battles in many African countries. When money becomes the main motivator for political socialization and determinant of electoral outcomes, it defeats the democratic principle of elections, reflecting the will of the people as they become a reflection of the power of money. Unfortunately, the legal and institutional framework for campaign financing in most African countries is either very weak or non-existent. In Kenya, Nigeria, Madagascar, and Tanzania, progressive laws have been enacted. The issue is reluctance to implement them. Additionally, there is lack of a vibrant continental coalition of citizen observers advocating for transparency in political financing. Alliance for Finance Monitoring (ACFIM) has brought together like-minded organizations from across the continent in response to the threat posed by monetization and commercialization of elective politics.
Welcome once again to today afternoon's session on the legal and institutional framework for campaign finance monitoring. We have more or less the same number of people that joined about 20 minutes ago. And I suggest we start. I wish to start by introducing the session. We shall be looking at the legal and institutional frameworks for campaign finance elections in Africa. And this is in line with the prevailing conditions of uncontrolled, undisclosed, and opaque political financing as identified in the Global Commission report on elections, democracy, and security. And this is a major threat to the integrity of elections in general in Africa, but also it tilts the ground for elections, and elections have turned into a public auction as compared to a platform for citizens to choose their leaders in a free and fair, harmonized environment. We have existing scholarships as well as reports of several election observers on how money disrupts democracy in Africa, and the question of political financing becomes critical for all the actors working to advance or entrench democratic governance on the continent. So if we take an example of how some countries have attempted to legislate for campaign finance regulations, but what is the implementation? What's the standard? And in countries where there is lack of campaign finance laws, what's the nature of elections in these countries? We shall be taking a case study of Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Madagascar, and Nigeria in these presentations by the panelists, but also the membership, which is beyond the sample study taken through panelists, will come in and expand the scope of understanding the impact of election financing and money in politics. I wish now to introduce our panelists. I will start with the hosts. Henry Muguzi, who is the Executive Director of Alliance for Campaign Finance Monitoring, based in Uganda, but working in Africa, but also chairperson of AFIONET, the Africa
Idulu, Sarah, of course, for me, as introduced, it's a pleasure for me to be here. And let's see, wait for her to come back. Looking forward to a quite interesting discussion.
Sarah, you're muted. Unmute.
Sorry, I am trying to see whether our panelists are on the call. Do you have everyone on the call?
I am here.
Felix, if you can check for me if we have all the panelists on the call.
All right, let me check.
As we wait for Felix to confirm who is with us on the call, I wish to inform panelists that Henry Muguzi is a seasoned campaign finance expert with 12 years experience in analyzing legal and institutional frameworks for campaign finance in several electoral jurisdictions, and is also one of the founding members of ACFIM.
They are on the call, Sarah. You can proceed.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Dr. Jamil Msami from Tanzania. Jamil coordinates the Directorate for Strategic Research, focusing on productive sectors and inclusive development, gender and human rights development, governance environment, as well as climate change. And he is a specialist in social policy from with a PhD from the University of Bristol. Jamil, you're welcome. Dr. Jamil, you're welcome to the session.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you all for having me. Jamil is actually my son. I am Jamal.
Jamal, sorry. Yeah, thank you for that, correction. Dr. Kate, sorry if I pronounce the names wrongly. Dr. Kate Kadriana.
Yeah, please just call me Kay. I think it will be easier for everyone. Kay is fine. Happy to be
Okay,
here.
Dr. Kay is a jurist and political scientist, executive director of Transparency International Madagascar Initiative since 2018. She's also a recognized human rights defender and lecturer in local democracy and governance at the Catholic University of Madagascar. Dr. Kay, you're welcome.
Thanks a lot for having me. A pleasure.
Our other panelist is Derek Mkandia, who is an advocate of Kenya with 10 years experience working in legal aid, governance, policy, human rights research, and electoral governance, and is currently working with Transparency International Kenya as a program officer for citizen demand and oversight. Derek, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm happy to be here.
And our last but not least on the panel is Festus Ojeumi, who is the head of programs, Democracy and Good Governance, Department of Justice, Development, Peacemakers Center in Nigeria. Justus, you're welcome. Is Festus with us?
Yeah, Festus is with us, but I think
he's muted.
Yeah. because I can see he's logged in.
Maybe we'll hear from him when he joins. So I would like to have an overall perspective on campaign finance, the landscape for Africa, as well as, shedding some light on Uganda. Henry, if you can give us that overall perspective, and I will be interjecting as you present. You're welcome, Henry, to start off the session.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I'll keep my video muted so that because I'm sharing this. Just a second. So I'm going just to give you an overview of the legal and institutional framework for campaign financing in Africa. The idea is to kind of trigger debate, around this. And of course, the reason this session becomes so important is because we know as the community that works on political finance that always when it comes to regulating money in politics, laws become the first line of defense. And of course, laws must be enforced by institutions. And so this is just an overview of where we are, African countries, in terms of legal and institutional framework. So I want to start by saying that in many countries in Africa, laws that regulate political party funding have been enacted. The issue, though, is implementation. In terms of laws are there, and most of these laws have provisions that regulate the financing of those political parties. However, when it comes to financing election campaigns, that remains opaque because, as we know, and we have a kind of a dearth of laws that regulate campaign finance as well. We do know for a fact, as we have come to see in the recent years, that too much money flows in our electoral politics, and it is mind-boggling where it comes from. And the laws have been put to the test, and they have not passed that test. So there are countries I want to mention here that have enacted the standalone laws to regulate political parties that also include political finance provisions. Examples here I mentioned is South Africa, Malawi. I think South Africa has a recent law enacted in 2018. Malawi is also recent. Namibia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Senegal, Ghana, and Zimbabwe. They have laws that are specifically regulating political parties. Now, however, only a few countries have been able to put in place, establish independent institutions that are charged with the responsibility of solely regulating political parties. And the examples we have Kenya, Tanzania, and Ghana. Now, in the rest of the countries, we do not have an independent institution that is charged with regulating political parties. Mostly what we have is that this role is entrusted with the electoral management bodies. In Uganda, it's the Electoral Commission that is in charge of regulating political parties. In South Africa, it is the Independent Electoral Commission. In Zimbabwe, the same. In Nigeria, it is INEC. So, and in many other countries, the same. So, but the challenge we are having is that the electoral management bodies tend to be overloaded by the too many roles. And one of the biggest is organizing and conducting elections. And when push comes to shove, they have tended to compromise the role of regulating political parties, leaving us in a context where political parties are almost de facto unregulated. All right. But when it comes to campaign finance regulations, we have many African countries have come up short. It is only in very few countries that you've seen provisions enacted to regulate campaign finance, and soon I'll tell you what those provisions should contain. But we saw in Nigeria that the new electoral law of 2022 had the very progressive provisions on regulating campaign financing, and I would imagine that it would be interesting to hear from Festus on how that is. Tanzania has a specific law. It is called the Electoral Expenses Act of 2010. It also has regulations. It speaks on how electoral expenses campaign expenses can be regulated. Malawi, the Political Parties Act of Malawi, I think 2018, also has the provisions that regulate campaign financing. And of course, now the confusing one is Kenya, because Kenya came up with a progressive law, which they called the Election Campaign Financing Act of 2012. But since then, that law has been rendered toothless, because on every electoral cycle, subsequent electoral cycle, to make it unimplementable, and as we speak, it has not been implemented. But we do know that TI Kenya, Africog, and I think Katiba Institute, we are able to go to court and petition to make sure that this law gets to be implemented. But specifically, I want to share with you some of the standard provisions, because when we say campaign finance laws, what are we talking about? There is an array of provisions that a standard campaign finance law should have. I cannot mention all of these, but I'll just pick out a few. For example, there should be bans on donations from foreign interests to political parties. There should be bans on donations from foreign interests to candidates. There should be bans on corporate donations to political parties for campaigns. There should be bans on corporate donations to candidates, bans on monies from trade unions. There should also be bans on anonymous donations. Earlier on, we were speaking about dirty money, dark money. This ban is supposed to cure that. And the reason they put all these bans is to make sure that they prevent the possibility of a group of people or an organization or an entity controlling the political party or the candidate. There should be bans on the use of state resources in that law. There must be a limit on an amount a candidate or political can contribute to a political party. I mean, a donor can contribute to a political party. There should be a limit on an amount a donor can contribute to a candidate. But the reasoning behind all these is to prevent the possibility of control and capture, because in many of our countries we have seen that our elected leaders get to be captured, the political parties get to be captured by those that bankrolled them to come to political office. Some of the other provisions may include limiting any-kind donations to political parties, limiting any-kind donations to candidates, a ban on political parties taking loans in relation to election campaigns. When political parties take loans, sometimes that also can lead to capture. But the most important thing is that they can use loans to circumvent the provisions on limits to how much a political party can access or a candidate can access from a particular source. We have seen in Uganda that when candidates take loans, they get to be captured. And many of the times candidates have been, held hostage by moneylenders. And so, and this has defeated the purpose of leadership, political leadership. There are also provisions around, there should be provisions around the requiring donations to go through a banking system. This is supposed to ensure that the donations can be tracked. These are standard principles of transparency. But also there should be provisions for direct funding to political parties, provisions for free or subsidized access to media for candidates, These are some of the provisions that should go into the standard campaign finance law, but which are lacking. And the last set of these provisions would be there must be limits on how much a party can spend in order for there for there to be some level of some semblance of a level playing field. So the political party can't just spend it because it can access all this money and crowd out the others in order to defeat the purpose of competition. And the same limits to apply to candidates. Political parties will have there should be provisions on reporting on both political parties and candidates, reporting on how much they have spent in an election. Okay, and there should be an institution designated to receive these reports, and there should also be sanctions. And so when you look at the legal framework for Africa, for many African countries, and look at what the standard election campaign finance legal framework should have, you get to see that we are really coming up short. But also when you look at the institutions that are mandated to enforce the campaign finance provisions, those that have them, that responsibility has been, entrusted with the electoral management body, and the electoral management bodies have often come up short in enforcing this responsibility because it is a big ask for them to in addition to organizing and conducting elections, which is a big thing in itself, to spare resources, time, and manpower to dedicate to enforcing the campaign finance provisions. So these, in short, these are the standard provisions. That's the situation we have in Africa, that we are falling short when it comes to regulating on campaign financing, even though we have tried our level best in terms of regulating the financing of political parties. But the aspects that speak to election campaigns seem to be lacking. Let me stop here, Sarah, and get back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Maybe you could give us, as you conclude, the specific happenings in Uganda as far as campaign financing is concerned. Uganda does not have a loan campaign financing. What explains this? But also for the countries that have laws on campaign financing, how have the laws improved the integrity of their elections, quality and integrity of their elections? Thank you.
Good question, Sarah. So I start with Uganda. Uganda does not have any provisos to regulate campaign financing. And the reason this is so is if you look at the standard provisions that should go into that law, number one, it would make it difficult for the party in power to continue using money to influence the outcome of elections. But also, the context is such that if you, for example, require opposition political parties and candidates to declare the sources of their money, then the very companies and individuals that finance political parties, opposition political parties and candidates are going to run into problems. Basically, the practice has been, if it transpires publicly that you have funded an opposition party or an opposition candidate, then the state machinery pounces on you. And normally they use the well-meaning institutions such as the tax body. They can descend on you and give you a tax assessment that you cannot handle, which would just make you run out of business. We have seen banks closed on such allegations. Now, so that won't happen. Now, the other thing you asked me to comment about, Sarah, those countries which have developed legislative, progressive legislations, how has that helped in improving the democratic dispensation? I would want to start with Nigeria and tell you that with Nigeria, it did not improve anything because the electoral management body chose not to enforce them. We are seeing a lack of appetite on the part of electoral management bodies to enforce these provisions, but also we are seeing that the electorate, the citizenry, does not seem to be interested in these. And this could be as a result of lack of awareness. In Tanzania, this law has been seen to be implemented rather selectively against the opposition, and so it's not clear how the ruling party Chama cha Mapinduzi gets to be sanctioned. Now, in the case of Kenya, as we have said, they have conspired on 2 electoral cycles, and the conspirators are the legislators themselves. The very parliament that enacted it is the one that has been making sure that it does not get enforced. So we need, I think, as Africans, to think deeply on how exactly we want to regulate campaign financing. And the reason being that we know for a fact that if we do not regulate the too much money that flows in election campaigns in Africa, we are not going to have anything like competitive elections. But so the thing is that, but also in the context of the witch hunt that is meted down by the parties in power, and the growing number of autocrats on the continent. What do we want to do? So I think let me stop here and it's time to hear from the rest of the colleagues exactly on what can be done. Back to you, Sarah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that opening presentation, Henry. I would like now to invite Dr. Jamal Msami from Tanzania to share with us his analysis on the topic, but also key examples, including the situation of implementation of the Elections Expenses Act in Tanzania. Welcome, Dr. Msami.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Henry, for setting the ball rolling. You've given a very succinct account of the status quo here in not just in Tanzania, but also within the region. With respect to the Election Expenses Act in Tanzania and its associated regulations, yes, it's an act that has been in place since 2010, but it's also one of the acts that has had one glaring omission, in that its enforcement has largely been selective, and to the best of our understanding, there hasn't exactly been any sanctioning of any of the entities. Now, I'll give you a very good reason, or rather 2 major challenges as to why enforcement of this particular act has been particularly problematic. And this is actually based on the 2010, 2015, as well as the 2020 election experiences. The first one is actually relates to the capacity and the mechanism with respect to the third party that is supposed to be enforcing implementation of this particular act. And in Tanzania, that is the Registrar of Political Parties, who is tasked with monitoring parties' expenditures in elections, as well as ensuring transparency in as far as candidates and the parties have actually been expended. Now, the challenge that the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties has is that it's severely understaffed. And the reason why is because elections are actually not seen as continuous events in Tanzania and in much of Africa. They're usually considered to be one-off, usually lasting not more than a few months within a particular cycle. And in the case of Tanzania, our elections usually come. The Office of the Registrar usually comes alive in the build-up to the local government elections, and subsequently in the build-up to the general election. So we're talking about an office that is supposed to be running on a daily basis, but usually only ever starts to act. It only ever becomes operational in a period not exceeding 12 months within any 5-year electoral cycle. So that's the one major issue, and this has actually led to some acute capacity deficiencies in the sense that the Office of the Registrar doesn't exactly have auditors required, nor does it have the expanded network in terms of ensuring that key provisions of the Act are actually adhered to. And then there's also a question of the legal framework that confers the mandates to the Office of the Registrar as not being particularly precise, in the sense that the legal mandate, the Election Expenses Act, it treats political parties as being private enterprises, and therefore it offers them wide discretionary powers on how to organize themselves, manage their own affairs, including financial matters. This very much relegates the role of the registrar to simply rely on audited accounts of the party. Now we all know the inherent delays that is associated with accessing audited accounts. So in any given election cycle, obviously the registrar usually have to wait at least for another 12 months before he can get access to the audited accounts of the parties. So the real actually there's actually a waste of the time that can actually end up being implemented. And a second major challenge is the question of transparency. The current Act doesn't exactly compel parties to submit the invoices of intended or procured election materials to the registrar for his or her own records. Now, in absence of this, the registrar usually has to make a request for this, and given the fact that very little actually ends up being documented in Tanzania, so it's usually a case of cooking books for the submission to the registrar. So usually the registrar doesn't have an acute and an accurate picture, so they usually end up working on estimates in relation to the amount of money that has been spent. You can try and look at the number of TP or written reports that a particular candidate or election party or political party is actually engaged in, the number of paraphernalia that have been engaged. Sometimes you can also end up estimating based on the number of hours that a helicopter has been hired during any particular election, for them to be able to get an overview of what these expenses are. And then one final challenge with respect to this Election Expenses Act is the fact that it is still relatively vague, in that, one, it doesn't exactly preclude the nation from foreign parties, from foreign agents, and secondly, it only ever compels the parties to disclose the information to the registrar if a donation exceeds 2 million Tanzanian shillings, roughly about $800 at this point in time. Now, this is where the challenge begins. And then, last but not least, usually the Expenses Act is usually accompanied by revised regulations at each general election, which usually ends up providing ceilings that can actually be used by the respective parties. Now, the challenge with these particular ceilings is that they're inherently unrealistic. It's typical to have a ceiling that caps spending at something like 7 million euros per political party for the entire election cycle. When individual candidates actually end up spending such amounts within less than 10 constituencies here in Tanzania. So the act is in itself effectively shooting itself in the foot for not being realistic in as far as the ceilings are concerned. So those are what I would say the three main challenges. But more broadly, underlying these challenges is the fact that election expenses, like I said at the very beginning, are seen as one-off events. They're not very well integrated into the broader public financial management framework in Tanzania, as they are in, and I suspect this is also the case in most other countries. So this tends to shield them from the sort of scrutiny that other public expenses are subjected to. Issues in relation to regular audits are not exactly being adhered to. Issues in relation to conforming to accounting and auditing standards are not exactly adhered to. And most importantly, issues in relation to tracking the amount of money the different parties actually spend in the build up to the elections, because Henry elucidated in his presentation, a significant amount of campaign financing actually ends up being spent way before the official start of election campaigns. And to make matters worse, specifically in the case of the parties in power, they usually tend to also deploy some of state-based machinery to foot some of these particular bills. So it's usually the case that they end up reassigning some public vehicles to support the campaigns of different candidates with different number plates. And really, this poses a challenge because there isn't a very convenient way of saying how much exactly has been spent by such parties in the build-up to an election or during the campaign season.
Thank you, Jamal, and really that's a rich presentation. I would like to ask that you give us some of the scholarly comparatives you have experienced in your work, or comparisons with the countries where democracy is developed and what Tanzania can do differently in comparison with these examples. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So some of the work that we've done some comparative work alongside some other colleagues in Uganda. We've done some comparative work involving Tanzania and Uganda. But this was actually focusing less on the legal and regulatory framework, but more on the extent of campaign costs in both Tanzania and Uganda. So even though we did do a third analysis of the institutions of support and campaign financing, but crucially, there wasn't exactly much to learn from Uganda because we're talking about similar peas in the same pot. And Uganda is actually one of the countries that is gradually mimicking some of the purposefully created institutions to camouflage democracy or to camouflage autocracy that currently prevail in Tanzania. So there wasn't exactly much learned in the case of Uganda, but what we can, what the wider literature actually says that specifically in areas such as in the most advanced countries, the key to giving teeth to these institutions is actually integrating, such to make campaign financing broader and a permanent fixture in as far as public financial management is concerned. So to subject political parties and their apparatuses to rules in relation to public finance, meaning statutory timely and regular statutory audits, meaning adherence to good accounting and audit practices, meaning improved transparency in as far as the reporting is concerned, posting the profit and losses accounts on public notice boards, including media, newspapers, and so on and so forth. And last but not least is actually having a third party that is responsible for ensuring compliance, that actually has not just the license, but also has the mandate and the wherewithal to actually enforce this particular act. So we're talking about, in the case of Tanzania, the register of the political parties, but really in most of the countries, this task usually is given to the Auditor General's office, and this is also associated with the Auditor General's report on the rate of implementation of the recommendations of findings past audits and the associated sanctions violating or not implementing the audit findings, which in most countries in Africa is sorely lacking. And unless you start moving towards that particular institutionalization and formalization of the broader campaign financing aspect, then chances are we'll still be beating around the bush.
Thank you very much. I would like now to bring in Dr. K. Dr. K, Madagascar has a relatively progressive law on campaign financing. What improvements has this done to the integrity of elections And could there be any challenges with enforcement? And how are these challenges being handled? As you share your broad perspectives on campaign financing in Africa, you could, share some perspectives, country-specific perspectives on the nature of the law in Madagascar and its enforcement. You're welcome, Dr. K.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Apologies for the background noise, but I'm in a very busy place. Nonetheless, so we do have laws in Madagascar like everywhere, but most of these laws are not enforced. It's just a case like in other countries in Africa that have been mentioned previously by our colleagues. We have the constitution, of course, and a law on political parties, another law on general elections created in 2018. And we have a commission who is in charge of the control of political financing. But the fact is that law on political financing is not effective because this commission, which has been created just to please, if I can say so, the donors, doesn't have any power and lacks resources in controlling the kind of expenses and the sources of funding for candidates running for elections and funding for political parties. So, of course, the laws in Madagascar puts, for instance, a ban on foreign donors, foreign donations to candidates, but the law allows companies or corporate donations to political parties, and there is no capping on all this. And this creates, a risk, a huge risk of state capture, which really is striking in Madagascar, because I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the last elections, presidential elections in 2018, for instance, we had 36 candidates, and almost a half of them have declared that they've been funded by Russia and Russian funds, while it is forbidden by the law to have donations from foreign governments or corporations. But nonetheless, the big lack in our laws is that there is no sanction for those who receive such donation from the outside. Moreover, it is interesting and also striking to know that in Madagascar, there is no capping on the amount that a candidate can spend during his electoral campaign. And this creates a huge disparity between the candidates and therefore threatens democracy. And this is why we have been campaigning for the capping of electoral funding first, and secondly, for mandatory transparency of all sources of funding. So we have advocated for this more than 2 years, along with other civil society organizations, because we will have presidential elections in November of this year, the 9th of November precisely. And so we have failed in our advocacy, unfortunately, for pledging for more transparency and for the declaration of the assets of the candidate as well, and for the capping. So this is really a huge problem in Madagascar, because you know that this country is very rich in terms of natural resources, and we fear that most of the candidates, will trade their funding against natural resources of the country. So there is a fact in Madagascar that when we approach elections, there is a huge increase in the trafficking of natural resources, may it be, precious wood, or also wildlife endangered species like turtles and other marine resources as well. We have huge traffics on that. So currently, unfortunately, I don't have good news for you. What we have is a complete lack of transparency, and there is the fact that there is little political will in Madagascar to pass progressive laws towards, the increase of transparency and political funding. And when I listened to Henry previously, when he spoke about the standard provisions for campaign finance legal framework, I see there's lots of ban on anonymous donations to candidates, donations from corporations with government contracts to candidates, for instance, everything, all of this, we are missing them in Madagascar. And there is no chance that the reforms that we have been pledging for pass this year, because the next parliamentarian session will be in October, which means it will be just 1 month before the next presidential election. So we feel a little bit desperate about that. And that's why we think that there is a huge need for us, CSOs and organizations working on finance campaign and also transparency and anti-corruption in Africa, to get united and to work together, towards this regional advocacy, towards better laws regarding elections in general, but in particular campaign finance, because it is too much blurred and this creates lots of risk for our countries in terms of state capture, elections being rigged, and influence from the outside. So I will stop there. Right now, this is the situation, but if you have questions, I will be very happy to answer them.
Yeah, Dr. K, before I let you go, are there auditing mechanisms in Madagascar or as part of the law? Is there an institution in charge of auditing the declarations of political actors? What is the mechanism for checks and balances?
Yeah, so officially we do have this, it's called Commission de contrôle de la finance publique in French. So it is a commission composed of financial judges in charge of controlling the declarations from the candidates. But the fact is, this commission is only composed of 6 judges, and they don't have any kind of budget. This is a country of 28 million people, which means it's quite a huge country. And when this controlling body is not working properly, it's not given the appropriate resources for functioning and for doing its job, you cannot expect anything from it. And the fact is, most of those judges composing this commission will be appointed by the head of the state, by the president of the republic. So there's also comes the problem of the lack of independence. So that's why we have been pledging for a total revision of the legal framework around the elections. But of course, it's the parliamentarians who decide and adopt the laws. They don't want to tie themselves, in this constraining mechanism. They want to remain free in gaining and asking for funding, but there's a lot of opacity. And this year, once again, we are very afraid that there will be a crisis after the elections, because some of the candidates last time spent $43 million in just campaigning in a country where 75% of the population lives with less than $2 a day. You see, it's insane. And there is this rule, money is ruling, big money is ruling elections in Madagascar, and we are very much worried about that. Thank you.
The last question to you, Dr. K, is the issue of public financing. You stated that political actors are prohibited from soliciting foreign funding. So what is the arrangement for public financing of political party activities in Madagascar?
Yes, so in Madagascar here, we don't have officially, we don't have provisions from the government or from the state to political parties. And this is a big lack, and political parties are pledging for the government to help them, gathering some money. But there is no such provisions. And most of the time, people who are in power or holding a public mandate use public funding for their own campaign. And once again, we within the civil society keep reporting this, but there are no sanctions provided in our legal framework. So it is very complicated, to tackle all these shortages, because it is a legal framework itself who is missing the main elements for promoting transparency and accountability at all levels. So definitely it's very complicated as a situation.
Wow, it seems we are more or less at the same level with the other African countries. So let me shift to Kenya. I hope Derek Makadia is on the group. Derek, if you can give us the Kenyan perspective on election finance monitoring and electoral laws for campaign financing. Derek, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And it's quite interesting to hear what the other countries are doing. Because as Henry had mentioned, we have quite a confused framework here in this country. But before I get into, or at least I don't want to get into so much the provisions of our laws, because they are not actually functional. We've never had any form of regulation in the country apart from what we have in paper. And I'm going to give a brief historical background on why that is the case. So for Kenya, actually, the very first time we attempted to have some sort of regulations on campaign financing was way back in 1974. And in that time, we had our main electoral law, which was called the National Assembly and Presidential Elections Act. We introduced a whole new chapter into that legislation to try to regulate the use of money in elections. And at that time, before that time, we had absolutely no way of, there was nothing to regulate on how money was used during campaigns. So we introduced a section called Section 18A up to L. There's a whole chapter, and it introduced some things such as spending limits, permissible expenditures, donation bans and limits, and quite a number of regulations similar to what we have today and similar to what Henry had presented. And that was in 1970s. But even after we had them, that I think it was in 1979, even after we had that law, there was a provision in that law which made it essentially ineffective. Because what the law provided was that campaign financing regulations, that specific section, would kick in after party primaries. But then at that time, Kenya had a one-party state. So after the party primaries, there was no campaigning after that. After the primaries, all the people who had been nominated, their names were submitted to the election bodies, and then they would just wait for 3 months, and then they are declared winners. So in a way, we had something that was designed not to work. We have a law that kicks in after elections, after elections, but we had that law until 1994, and in before that law came, around 1992, we amended our constitution, which allowed us to have multiple parties. So we went into our first multi-party elections in 1992, and we had that law. But for some reason, it seemed that it had been forgotten by politicians. It seemed like it was something that was just lying there. No one paid attention to it. But after the elections, the MPs came together and decided to repeal that legislation. From 1997, after that specific provision, that specific chapter was repealed, we've had no formal regulations at all in terms of our laws. But we come very close to our constitution, and we had a new constitution in 2010. And during the process of making our constitution, the need to have some form of regulations was very prominent, and the need for the country to just regulate the amount of money, the impact of money in democracy was very prominent if you look at our constitutional making documents. In 2005, we tried to have a new constitution, but we were not successful. But in that constitutional making process, we attempted to introduce in the constitution a provision that required the election management body to regulate the amount of money that political parties will use to campaign. And at that time, the context in which we were working with was politics and campaigns happened within a political party. But as we've moved on as a country, we have shifted from that. Now, a lot of campaigns happen around an individual and around a candidate and not a political party. But that was 2005. That effort to amend the constitution was not successful. So we continue without any form of regulations, not in the constitution, not in any law. And in 2010, we finally had a new constitution. Now, in this new constitution, we, as well, if you look at the historical documents, there were attempts that were made to have campaign financing in the constitution, first of all, before it was in any other laws. So in the historical documents, the committee of experts, which was a committee that we set up to draft this new constitution for us, documents that they did a first draft. This was around 2009. They did a draft. The draft had incorporated into it a clause which required our election management body to regulate the amount of resources, the amount of money that can be used in campaigns. But when they took that draft to Parliament, because the Parliament was required to approve and review all drafts before we voted for them in the referendum, Parliament removed that clause and returned the draft to this committee of experts without that clause. But the committee of experts in their report say that they sort of sneaked in back in because they felt it was too important for this to be there and not to be left to Parliament for them to make a law if it is not anchored in the constitution. So they returned it back into the constitution, and that is the final draft that we voted for in our referendum, and we passed it. So that was in 2010. Now we have a constitution. We have a new constitution. We are going to have new elections. The constitution requires the election management body to draft regulations, but it also requires Parliament to pass more legislation on elections. So in 2010, that is where we are. We are very hopeful as a country. The elections are coming 3 years from then, 2013. We get close to the elections, and Parliament tries, among its several obligations to make new laws which are in compliance with the Constitution, Parliament tries to pass a new law on election campaign financing, and it was called the Campaign Financing Bill of 2012. But for some reason, this bill does not pass before the elections. It lags in Parliament. Elections come, elections near, nothing happens. All the other legislations on elections are passed except this campaign finance legislation. So it doesn't go anywhere. And now we get into the first election after the new constitution in 2013 with only a provision of the constitution that says the election management body should pass regulations, but we don't have an act to give that clause life. So we get into the 2013 elections, no regulations except that constitutional provisions, and that happens. But interestingly, when this new parliament comes into place, the first parliament after the constitution in 2013, one of the first legislations they pass within 6 months is the Campaign Finance Act of 2013, which Henry made reference to, and it's actually 2013, not 2012. So we have this very new, this new parliament coming into a new constitutional dispensation, seemingly looking very objective and progressive, and giving us a new act. So we have an act now we have the constitution, we have the election management body, we have 5 years to the elections, we have enough time to prepare. And this act has a clause that says that every year before the elections, the election management body will draft regulations and submit those regulations to Parliament for Parliament to approve them before they are in force. But at that time, I think no one saw any issue with it. I think we were all too excited. We have something eventually, and we wait for the elections. A year before the elections, the election management body indeed drafts regulations. So these are now the 2017 elections. So a year before, the election management body drafts regulations, sends this to Parliament for approval. But interestingly, Parliament rejects them for a variety of very weak reasons. It says they are not practical, they are not constitutional, it's too late, and whatnot. So just a basket of excuses. So Parliament rejects those regulations in 2016. But then it goes further and suspends the entire act for a period of 1 year, up to after the general elections. So we have no act, it is suspended. We have no regulations, they have been rejected, and the elections are here. But then I think also, as Henry had mentioned, Jamal, because the election management body is so focused at that time in managing the elections and not these campaign financing issues, it focuses its energies on the elections. This issue of campaign financing is left on the side. We have our elections in 2017, and then the expiry clause expires. So after 2017, now we have the act is now back after its expiry clause expired. The act is now back, and we wait now for the 2022 elections. We still have our act. We still have that 1 year clause, and then we wait. In 2021, 1 year before the 2022 general elections, this is now the third elections after the new constitution. IBC, of course, the election management body drafts regulations again, sends them to Parliament, but as Parliament, as usual, rejects them again. For the same reasons, it says they are not practical, they are not constitutional, they are in conflict with the Act. And so just a bunch of reasons. And if you actually look at the regulations, they are more or less largely copied from the Act. So you can't say an Act is regulations are constitutional when they are a mirror reflection of the Act and just forms and timelines and what other things. So again, now this is 2021, Parliament has rejected the regulations. So ideally at that point you are thinking we have nothing at all. Again, we are going to go into our third elections after the new constitution without any regulations at all. But TI Kenya, together with Katiba Institute and a few other organizations, we go to the High Court. We try to challenge this. We argue that this act should be self-regulating, and if anything, the constitution gives this mandate to IBC, our election management body, to do the regulations, and that should be something that IBC, our election EMPs, should be able to do without going through Parliament. That Parliament approving regulations from IBC is tantamount to overlapping its jurisdiction. It has no function there. But Parliament argues that it is us who donate power, not the Constitution. We made the Campaign Financing Act, which should regulate this, which should be the overarching framework. And the court gives us a very weird judgment. On one hand, the court decides to split regulations and spending limits. The spending limits are how much you can spend for any position. Regulations are how you report it, where you can get the money from, how you handle the money, how you handle the donations, the sources, and whatnot. So the court splits the two, says spending limits are a direct function of the constitution and should go by themselves. They do not require parliamentary approval. But regulations get parliamentary approval, but one can't go without the other. So that was not a very good judgment to us. It basically put us in one sticky situation to another, and we have since filed an appeal. So as I speak today, we are doing quite a lot of advocacy to try to reform the laws that we have on campaign financing, especially that act. We are trying to have stakeholder engagements, trying to review the act to see what can be improved. Of course, I think we have sort of designed to partly designed to the fact that before you amend any legislation, you need parliamentary support, the same support which we were not getting. And of course, Parliament has embedded itself into this campaign financing framework so much. And we find it odd because they are basically regulating themselves, which is against our constitution. They're in a position where they can decide how much they want to spend, which is, of course, not practical. So that is the sad situation we find ourselves in, Sarah. But if I had more time, I would have delved more into what we are doing and the act itself and its provision. The act seems solid, but it has this specific provision which makes it not functional. Sarah?
Yeah, thank you very much. I will just ask you two questions as we wind up your presentation. One is that the current law and the constitutional framework, in your view, does it provide, in the absence of regulations, does it have auditing mechanisms for post-election analysis and the accountability? And two, how would you gauge the use of money in elections in Kenya? Because Kenya is also known as a high spender in elections, closely following Uganda and other countries. And how does this money affect the quality and integrity of elections?
Thank you, Sarah. So thank you for the questions. In terms of audit, the act itself requires that number one, the election management body, which we call it the IEBC, the Independent Election and Boundaries Commission, it gives it the power to audit books of accounts that have been submitted by the candidates themselves after elections. And there are quite a number of offenses that it prescribes if those accounts are not properly done. It also allows the election management body to request the Auditor General to audit those accounts. So in terms of audit, it's more or less well thought out. But then there's the issue of practicality in terms of is our election management body actually able to audit all these accounts? In the last election, I think we had over 4,000 candidates. So if you have 4,000 candidates submitting to you books of accounts, are you really, is our election election body really actually able to have the capacity to audit all those accounts and even monitor the campaigns during that period before the elections? Is it able to monitor how campaigns are being done, how expenditure is being made, how donations are coming in? So it's the issues of capacity of our body, whether it is actually able to do that. In other, there's usually self audits and self monitoring, so that parties and candidates monitor each other. But in our country, I think that's going to be quite a tall order. In terms of whether the act can be self-implementing, that is what we argued in court. We say that this thing should be self-implementing. It doesn't need regulations. But the court did not agree with us, and we've since appealed. Hopefully, we will get a favorable judgment in that. On the second question on the use of money, yes, actually, Kenya is a very big spender in elections. Let me just give a few examples. In the last elections, in the previous elections, one of the ways there was a campaign coming through your town or your village was a caravan of trailers. But in the last elections, there have been an increase in helicopters that have been used. So the indicator of a campaign are helicopters. You could find even 10 helicopters coming to a small town, doing campaigns and then moving to another place. It was actually reported in the year before the elections, Kenyans actually imported more than 40 brand new helicopters 6 months to the elections. So you just get an idea of the amount of money being used. It was also reported in our newspapers that the cash in circulation outside banks got to 252 billion Kenyan shillings 6 months before the elections. And a year before that, the amount in circulation out of banks was only 3.69 billion. So you can imagine a jump from 3.69 to 252 billion shillings during that election period. It was also reported that in the 3 months before the elections, Treasury incurred 54 billion shillings in unbudgeted public expenditure. And if you keenly followed our elections, the incumbents, both incumbents were more or less in the election. So this also brings the issue of circulation of money use of public resources in campaigns. And then lastly, just to give also another small example, during the last elections, one of our presidential flag bearer, one of the front forerunners, Raila Odinga, held a fundraising dinner to fundraise for his elections, and the dinner was costing 1 million shillings per plate. That is around 10,000 US dollars per plate. Now, in the previous elections in 2017, something similar was done by the former president, Uhuru Kenyatta. And within 2 hours, they said they had raised around 2 million USD within 2 hours. 2 million USD within 2 hours of that dinner and people giving pledges. That was in 2017. In 2022, Uhuru Kenyatta was supporting Raila Odinga, and they held a similar event. So if in 2017, 2 billion Kenyan shillings was raised in 2 hours in one dinner, how much do you think was raised in 2022? Because they were asked by the media and they said they exceeded expectations. So if you can try to just do the math yourself and think what exceeding expectations looks like. If 5 years ago, 2 billion was raised in 2 hours, and now 5 years later, what target they put? Obviously more than 2 billion. And what does exceeding expectations mean? Thank you, Sarah.
Derek, and I will have our last presentation as we get to the general discussions, comments. Members on the call, you can start posting your comments so far in the chat, and we'll also have time for you to speak. The next hour is for general discussion. I want now to invite in Festus Ojeumi from Nigeria. Can you please share with us the Nigerian experience? You've just concluded one of the most expensive elections in Africa by electing the aging billionaire. And we don't know whether it was the money or the ideas that put him into power. You're welcome. We can't hear you well, Festus.
What if you remove those ear pieces?
Yes.
Plug it out completely.
Hello?
Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
now we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Like I said, in Nigeria, we just concluded our general election that was in February and March, and it was serious. Now, starting from the Electoral Act, this will be the first Electoral Act we actually be using first time, so to say, because it was actually signed last year, around January 2022. And the electoral law, that electoral act actually contains a lot of regulations. And I agree with Henry when Henry was actually presenting the other time the contents of what the laws must contain. And I can say categorically that in our new electoral law, we can find everything there. When I say everything, almost everything inside the law. I'm going to share some of the laws with us. And not only that, we have our Constitution 1999 as amended that actually contains some of these campaign finance regulations. When we talk about campaign finance regulation, let me talk about Nigeria. If it's not well regulated, a time will come that there won't be money for any government to spend even at the end of the election. It's something so annoying talking about the magnitude of money that actually goes into election. Let me start with Nigeria. You know, in Nigeria, the constitution allowed the political parties to actually determine the kind of election to run during primaries. They can actually run direct primaries. They can also run indirect primaries. And also they can actually present a consensus candidate, you know, during the primary election. And the constitution, Nigerian constitution actually allows that. Now, talking about what actually transpired during the indirect primaries of the incumbent party, a delegate was actually given to the tune of like 10 million naira per delegate. And in situations wherein we have over 2,000, 3,000 delegates. Actually, the norm has been that once there is primary and any political party wants to adopt indirect primaries, people fight to become delegates because through that, one can become a millionaire overnight, just being a political party delegate to attend indirect primary. And that is to tell you the magnitude of money that goes into primary. And the funniest thing is the new electoral act stated that irrespective of humongous amount of money you have spent during primaries, is still not part of campaign finance. That the campaign finance start the expenses start the day INEC, which is the electoral management body, the day INEC announced the commencement of election. That is the day the money you spend. That is the day it begins to count, and hundreds of billions are usually spent during primaries alone. Let me start an example. A gubernatorial aspirant was actually called in one of the states in Nigeria and said, can you just set at least 250 million naira, Nigerian naira, that if you're able to set at least 250 million naira and you are not being felt, then that is when we will know that you are ready for campaign. Let me tell you the amount of money incumbent political party candidates ask their aspirant to pay 100 million naira. That you want to run, you want to participate in primaries, you are to pay 100 million naira per person. And you needed to come and see how hundreds of people were paying 100 million naira. And as a matter of fact, it is not in the constitution, it is not in the legal framework to regulate the amount each political parties sell their forms. So you can now see 100 million naira, and people were just giving out 100 million naira as if they are just giving 1,000 naira. So that is to let you know in Nigeria, when my Kenyan counterpart was talking, I was just smiling because it has not even gotten to the amount of money Nigerian politicians spend when it comes to election. I'm not even talking about election. I'm talking about pre-election era, party primaries. Actually, they have stopped spending naira. They actually spend dollars because dollars flow freely. Dollars flow freely when it is election time, especially the just completed election in February and March. So it is to show that the highest bidder now wins the election. That is the situation of them. Not that we do not have legal framework or institutions. We do, like I said. But the willingness to implement what has been written on paper becomes very problematic. And I'm going to tell us some of the reasons why it's problematic. Number one reason is these political parties, especially those in government, try to put their own in strategic positions. Like one of the agencies responsible to prosecute all these illicit funds, we call them EFCC, Economic and Financial Crime Commission, EFCC. But in the situations wherein the president that is actually running for a particular position, he will be the one to choose the president of the EFCC. We also have ICPC, Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission. These are the institutions saddled with the responsibility to actually prosecute whosoever that violates the electoral law. Like I said, time will not permit you to begin to tell us what is in the electoral law. Everything Henry said is actually found in our new electoral act of 2022. Everything talking about the limits a political party must spend. Like for the presidential candidate, as a presidential candidate, you must not spend more than 5 billion naira. And before the amendment, it was actually 1 billion naira. And as governorship candidates, you must not spend more than 1 billion naira. Actually, the report we presented to the general public and to the National Assembly, where these are the things that actually guided them to increase the money for presidential candidates. It was increased to 5 billion naira from 1 billion naira. But despite this increase, it's not realistic. Because during 2019 general election that we tracked nationally, it revealed when it was earlier 1 billion naira per candidate. The outcome of that tracking process revealed that the incumbent then spent over 9 billion naira. And these are expenses we were able to track. Not to talk about many expenses that cannot be tracked. Over 9 billion naira as at 2019. And if we want to talk about the amount spent in this just completed election, dollar was actually flowing freely, actually. A lot of money. But there are regulations, there are institutions that ought to be checkmating these political parties. But there are a lot of challenges. Why Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, cannot actually enforce this, cannot actually implement this. One of it is lack of capacity building. I remember in 2021, when we were asked to actually train election and party management of INEC across the country. There is a section in INEC and is across each of the states. They call it election and party monitoring departments. That's an institution in INEC that are saddled with the responsibility to track party primaries, party expenses, party campaigns, and all the likes. But we discovered that the staff of this INEC lack necessary powers, lack necessary experience to actually track campaign finance. Actually, because when it comes to tracking of campaign finance, we have been on it for the past 6-7 years, and we know what it takes to track. When you want to track effectively, talking about the methodology in tracking, talking about deployment of personnel. So number one, INEC cannot. INEC lacks that power to actually that because of manpower. aside that, even in terms of finance, there is no way INEC could get the finance to track campaign finance. And I will tell you why. If Nigeria continues to spend humongous amounts that INEC, that is being allocated for INEC every 4 years, if we continue to spend that humongous amount, we are speculating that in the next 10 years, Nigeria may not be able to get funds to finance, because we spend heavily. We spend heavily on elections, not only on general election. In Nigeria has 36 states of the Federation. Out of these 36 states, 8 states actually run off-cycle election. And when we mean off-cycle election, these are the states that do not run election with others, probably because of the court judgment, removal, they are not 8. Anytime there is off-cycle election, we spend humongous amount of money for the deployment. It will be the state doing off-cycle election, it will be the whole state will be militarized. There will be deployment of heavy security. And in the process of mobilizing these security operatives, we spend billions of naira on it. And these are some. So challenge number 1 is INEC actually lacks capacity to carry out campaign finance tracking. Not only that, they also lack manpower. It requires huge manpower to actually track campaign finance. And as a matter of fact, during elections like this, Nigeria is a very big country with estimated amount of 210 million people. 210 million people. At the just concluded 2023 election, 93 million people were eligible voters. 93 million people, according to the voter register INEC presented. You can imagine how huge. And in dealing with huge number, and talking about Nigeria over 250 dialects. So Nigeria is actually a very big country. And that is why our election is actually taking a lot of money. And that is why, just
Festus, we can't hear you, but as you conclude, okay, you have.
yes.
So, if you can conclude, yes.
Okay, sorry, I was attending to something. So, and that these are challenges. These are actually challenges we have in terms of the implementation. Like I said, we have the legal framework. In addition to this, presently at the National Assembly, there is a National Electoral Offences Commission establishment bill. These are the commission we're actually pushing for in order to ensure that the responsibility of prosecuting electoral offenders are taken from INEC soldiers, so that at least there will be more, effort in trying to actually track and in trying to see that the offenders are prosecuted. That settles it. In the Nigerian Electoral Act of 2022, there are a lot of challenges. Some of the challenges is the amount of money IMAC as penalty is very small compared to the offense. Let me cite an example. You can imagine the maximum amount an individual can give a party candidate is 50 million naira. And the law states that whoever that gives more than 50 million naira will pay a fine of like 1 million naira. You can imagine that. You can imagine someone that gave us over 50 million naira, and you ask the person to pay 1 million naira. The person will not need to go back to the bank before paying that 1 million naira. And these are the lacuna, and it was deliberate. Political parties actually put it that way because they realized that they will always violate. And that is why it's okay, we know we have violated, okay, we are ready to pay. And the payment will not actually cost them anything. And these are some of the challenges that we're being faced. Well, there are a lot to discuss as per Nigeria electoral system, but one thing to establish is there are frameworks, there are legal frameworks. INEC is saddled with the responsibility of enforcing, but there are a lot of challenges they are actually facing in executing that. And these are some of the challenges. Well, I want to stop there and entertain questions so that we can be able to talk more. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Festus, and all our panelists. Now the debate is open. I've seen one or two comments in the chat about the role of citizens in demanding for implementation of laws on campaign financing. But by a show of hands or typing in the comment section, I wish to invite members on the call to make their contributions or comments to the discussions that have been ongoing. Maybe as we wait for the members of the audience to come to the discussions, I will have one question for Dr. K. Dr. K, what do you think we can do differently in as far as regulating money in elections and campaign financing? But also I would like to ask our hosts, ACFIM, to get us comments, online comments from the hashtag Money in Politics, as well as other platforms as we wait for the audience on the call to participate. Dr. K, take it up.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I think that as we have been exchanging in the chat box, what we need to do better is to mobilize the citizenry, all citizens, so that those demands that we carry, you know, that advocacy that we push for better regulations of finance regulations are carried together with the citizens, not just by us, civil society, because most of the time it is this people power which is missing in the game, because I do believe that if everybody, each and every citizen, is conscious of the fact that this lack of regulation is affecting the state of democracy in a country, the quality of election itself, and we have the big risk of having always bad rulers because of the lack of regulation, then maybe this advocacy will function. So we have to explain them what is at stake. How does the mechanism around big money in politics, it is also linked, you know, to political corruption, how it affects their daily lives. Maybe they will be keener to support our cause, because this is the case in Madagascar. We've been advocating for more than 2 years, and we had little support from the population in this quest. That's why I think members of parliament and politicians in general, you know, just laughed at the idea that we proposed of capping campaign funds and advocating for more transparency. So we need to educate people, and this has to become really everyday's business and everybody's business, because otherwise, you know, this will be an infinite cycle of elections rigging, piloted and fueled by dirty money. So it's totally insane. I think that's the main point for me, because, and the other thing as well is exchanging good practices and finding ways, you know, to harmonize our regulations within the continent. I know that we are maybe living in different contexts, but when hearing from colleagues who share their experiences from their countries, I think that there are common grounds for us to work together. How can we pledge for, you know, harmonized campaign regulations and finance regulation on the continent? And we have these instruments, the ACTEC, the African Charter on Elections, Governance and Democracy. We should take the advantage of this charter for those of us who have ratified it. Madagascar has, but doesn't implement it. How to make it binding more and how to follow up on its implementation. Shouldn't we also advocate at, you know, at a strategic level within the African Union or elsewhere for a bettering of those regulations, so that also those regional institutions put pressure on our respective countries for them to comply a little bit more to those regional instruments. That's what I can say right now, but I think Felix has his hand raised, so maybe he wants to say something. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, Felix, take it up.
Thank you so much, Sarah and the panelists. I have about 2 issues to raise, and the questions known to any particular person. One is around the fact that the conversation on campaign financing, especially talking about legislation, in many of the African countries remains more of an elitist kind of conversation. Probably I would want to know what else can we do to take this conversation to the common person to appreciate the need for reforming or legislating on campaign spending or campaign financing and bring that interest among the population. Because when you talk about money in politics, there is the element of supply and demand. On the other end of the prism are the electorate who are increasingly having all these sorts of demands to the politicians. So that is one issue. And secondly, this could also, another question which is related to that one is around, there's been that common argument from experience that poverty is a driver to the behavior of electorate in the way they transact during elections. So I don't know how far true that is from experience of the different panelists here. Probably they could share whether really the argument of poverty is that a factor in being a driver in frustrating all efforts to decommercialize, including one among which is the legislation, coming up with legislations. But my last other issue is around the observation that I've listened in the experiences of Kenya, including experiences of Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, and also Madagascar. It's clear that legislating on campaign financing, it's difficult to achieve or to make headway when you have the same beneficiaries. We're talking about legislators here who are part of the entire prism or the scheme. For them to legislate, put up a law that is working against them, whether that is really feasible, and in the event that they are not forthcoming or cooperative to legislate on how much they should spend. What other options do we have? For example, I know in some jurisdictions, like in the global north, there have been efforts of having what we call citizen juries, where that involve the wider community in the process of decision making, probably by extension also legislation. Is this one of the things that we could consider as one way of sidestepping the selfish interests of legislators to legislate themselves by introducing these interesting reforms around campaign financing? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felix. And the panelists, please write down their comments. I would like now to invite Mule to share your insights on campaign financing and the contributions to the debates. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think I also want to thank the panelists for very well articulated presentations based on their respective areas where they are working at and the countries that they're also coming from. Now, this is a very interesting debate, and I think with Henry and others, we have had this very long debate about how we're going to deal with this particular problem on the continent in terms of money. I was just looking at one of the videos which is emerging from Gabon on the Bongo issue, where he is appealing for international intervention, and then one of the comments is saying that there's a very sarcastic comment from one of in our tweets, which says, "I can't hear you beyond the luxury of your where he's seated beyond the gold that is around him. So he can't hear properly. So he says he can't hear properly what the Gabonese president is saying because he's surrounded by luxury, and therefore it is not clear what he's saying. So basically that's sarcasm from a voter, I am thinking, or from a citizen. But the big story in Africa, and this is one of the areas which is where I want to pick up from Felix. The demand-driven aspect, the demand aspect of this is an area we may need to concentrate on. We have laws in Kenya, and there are quite a host of other countries in the continent, as articulated by Henry when he did the introduction, where there is some regime. But it is also very apparent that the elites or elite interests, in this case, our parliaments, our leaders, are not going to do anything about this. We were discussing, I mean, you remember the case of the gold mafia in Zimbabwe, and now we see who has become the president as a result. So they're not going to do anything about this because they are incentivized by that circumstance. And perhaps the conversation needs to move to the issue of a demand-driven initiative. And this is where I will just look into two things. Number one is the question of the norms, African norms. Could we, if we were to unpack the African norms, do we get a latitude in our cultures that allows for the citizens, ordinary citizens, to be able to easily receive money or accept or create a conducive environment that the people with money can be able to maneuver? Those African cultures where we like giving out, sharing out, giving out presents, are those norms perhaps which are allowing this menace to grow? Do we create latitudes within our cultures? Maybe we need to investigate that. And the other side of it is that we know that within African cultures, ethics is a central issue. Then again, using those ethical attributes from nearly every community, how can we be able to also arrest this particular issue? If such a comment is coming about Bongo, it does mean there's an African somewhere who believes that this kind of riches is really unethical, should not be allowed. These are not the kind of leaders that we are looking at. But how do we use that opportunity where the integrity issues, ethical issues are very manifest within our cultures, within our norms? How can that be translated into some kind of information and campaign that can engineer a demand-driven thinking as far as question of money in politics is concerned? Let me stop at that, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mule. I will invite, I see there's a debate in the chat between Dr. K and Derek. Dr. K, you suggest that we should elect clean members of parliament who will be able to legislate on the issue of campaign financing. That's more like the debate of the egg and the chicken, because most of this, where will you get the clean members of parliament and amidst excessive use of money in elections? Our elections are literally a public auction, and the highest bidder gets to be elected. The person who can bribe most goes through elections. In Uganda today, you need $500 million minimum, $500 million shillings to go to parliament. And that's the least money that you can use in a constituency to be elected an MP. And Derek, you're suggesting that we need to address the demand side of citizens, the same question posed by Mule. And Dr. K, we need to explain citizens what they are losing in not having proper regulations, state capture, loss of natural resources, sudden revolving door scheme. Big money is linked to political corruption, and we are all hostages for this lack of integrity in ethics and politics. I understand the dilemma. I don't know, Festus, I see you have your hand up, but you are a panelist. Do you want to come in now? First,
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. I quickly want to react to the question raised by Felix on the issue of poverty. If it's poverty that is actually driving this problem, I want to use Nigeria as a typical example in reacting to that singular question he asked. Nigeria has a population of like 210 million. Out of this population of 210 million, 133 million people are living below $1. That is why Nigeria is made as the world poverty of the whole world. You can see that now. Anytime we track campaign finance and vote buying, this actually plays out. And you can see to the extent that 1,000 naira, politicians give electorate 1,000 naira to vote in order to buy their vote, as small as 1,000 naira is. And by the time you engage them, they tell them that if they have like family of 5 that is eligible to vote, that makes 5,000 naira. Say that 5,000 naira is actually enough for them to cook a pot of soup. So this issue that we're talking about has to do with the poverty. Poverty is one of the things that is actually fueling this inability to track campaign finance. And politicians actually know, and that is why they siphon money. They use state administrative resources, all the power within their jurisdictions to ensure that they come to power, because they know when they get to power, definitely they will siphon. So just to quickly react to that question, that if it is poverty that is responsible, poverty is actually bad. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Festus. I would like to invite the other panelists to comment on the issues raised, starting with Henry.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been quite an interesting discussion and quite a provocative one at that. Now, of course, if you reflect on the current debate that is going on in the global north, I think Felix alluded to it. The point of legislators not being able to, having let down citizens in terms of legislating on issues that would impact on them, in which case they are proposing use of citizen juries, where citizens themselves then come up with alternative mechanisms. I think you would see that the whole epidemic, that epidemic is more prevalent here in the global south, and in Africa it being worse. You see that the political class has pretty much let us down. We do not expect a lot in terms of them legislating on the very laws that are going to bind on them. The examples of Madagascar, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, I don't know how Nigeria pulled it off, but I think they knew how to play around, circumvent it. Otherwise, they would have conspired to undermine it. Yeah, so they would, if they will not allow legislation to go through, then is it possible that we, the citizens, can then provide some alternative and patch together a functional oversight? When you speak to people about issues, the negative effects of unregulated money in politics, many of our people on the ground tell you that somehow they know that it is bad. And they also know that something else has to be done. But the challenge is that each of them wants somebody else to do it, not themselves. And so the thing then, the tall order we face is, how do we then get to interest? How do we get to generate the interest of this citizen to understand and make a connection between the conditions they are living in, the poverty they are grappling with, and the selfish nature of politicians? How are we going to package a message to the effect that the men and women who seek political power do not seek power for power's sake, but they seek power to control resources, and this control resources is not to improve the conditions of the electorate, but it is to enrich themselves and keep enriching themselves endlessly, while also leveraging the things that would have held them accountable. So how do we get to then convince this? And so I think what I can see there, and I want to agree with Derek, is now to be more consistent. Often we've not, I think, spent enough time. We've not spent enough time mobilizing the citizenry to make sure they come into play. And of course, the last thing I want to make also concerns what Mule raised about the riches of this, I mean, about the inconsequential nature of the wealth, the self-enrichment, because if Ali Bongo is now calling upon the very Western powers to come and rescue him, the very man who did not invite international observers and kept the election of the country kind of, enveloped in secrecy and shrouded in darkness. Now he's popping up at the very point of need, and then he wants help. So it should be like lesson to the citizens, but that you see, this wealth these fellows are coming with is inconsequential. We have to go back to our very good, and I think we can find something within our cultures, our norms, our values, the Ubuntu values we have as Africans, to be able to come up with something. Sarah, I don't have much to say, because this is an issue that would need us to continue holding conversations, and regular ones at that, to make sure that we arrive at a definite solution. For now, let me stop there. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Let's have Jamal and Blessing in that order. Jamal, if you can respond to some of the issues that have been raised.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Two main issues. One, with respect to how to strengthen campaign financing. One, I think in the main we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're talking about institutions that are already deeply entrenched and institutions that are already conveying rents to the people that are running these particular institutions. So in this particular instance, we should not be expecting abrupt changes. Rather than change can come incrementally, and we should try and take in lessons as we go along, agitating for change. Now, one of the reasons why we're actually where we are at this moment in time is because while we've had a raft of policies, laws, and regulations, really the reason why these laws have actually not been very particularly successful is because they're not exactly addressed some of the underlying norms, some of the underlying cultural aspects that govern elections or indeed the electorate in Africa. I'll give you a very good example. We over time, I think one other thing that we also need to be appreciative of is that over time we've had our norms changing, and this has been crafted deliberately by those particularly in power. We have had patronage politics for a very, very long period of time, to the extent that it has now become customary in some areas for politicians to give something, to give handouts when they need something else from the electorate. Now that we need to also, when we're reforming campaign financing laws, we need to be cognizant of that we need to also be battling these other institutions that have already been normalized, but by the electorate, for them to be able to go hand in hand with the sort of reforms that we want in as far as campaign financing is concerned. So crucially, that's deeply institutional. But also I think we can also take heart. We can take heart in the sense that with the rise of enabling technologies, specifically social media, we've seen that there will come a time, as it has happened in some parts of South America, whereby the question of money will not exactly be one of the most decisive ones. It will end up being a question of how effective a particular candidate ends up reaching out to his constituency, but also therein lies the issue of affordability of the means to be able to access these electronic media channels. Once we can sort that out as part of the broader investment in social and physical infrastructure, then gradually we can see a way in which you can mitigate the effect of money when it comes to campaign financing through the rise of enabling technology and social media and the like. On the question of poverty being a variable, not so much. I mean, Africa, we're not that unique. We have there's similar problems in the developed world, even in the United States of America, wherein financing wherein there are actually very strong correlations between the amount of money that a particular candidate can mobilize, with the extent to which they're able to effectively campaign and eventually the votes that they end up getting. But one of the reasons why this particular problem is more profound in Africa is because of the electoral systems. We have an overwhelming number of our countries that are relying on the first past the post system, whereby so it's basically a winner takes all kind of a setup. It is my belief that a move towards a more nuanced proportional representation approach that encourages the participation of smaller parties and also guarantees the inclusion within the broader electoral and also the broader governing framework, that will also go a long way towards mitigating some of the influences of money when it comes to campaign financing. Thank you.
Sarah there? I think Sarah, you are there? Dr. Kitakandre, I think you can have your say.
Yes, I think when I said that we need to elect, better politicians as members of parliament or any kind of ruler, I really meant it because it is the only way for us to make our advocacy happen and to have those tools that we are desperately needing from the political asset. And it is only a way for educating citizens on all these political matters, because poverty is always taken as an excuse in countries like ours, and I can relate as Madagascar is classified as the 5th poorest countries in the world. So people will say, no, we are too poor to think about politics. If people want to give us money during the elections, let them do. Don't cap their funding, their expenses. So we really need to emphasize the impacts of dirty money in politics, the impacts on our societies, the impact in our economies, and it is a long-term impact, while the satisfaction citizens or voters may have from a political bribe is just a short-term satisfaction. So we need to explain them the pros and cons of such a choice. And as long as we don't have this people power in March for cleaner elections, a cleaner regulatory framework around political finance, then we are losing at it, because we are all convinced here that this is essential, but we cannot make this happen by ourselves. We need to have people power with us. Thank you.
Are you back, Sarah?
Very much, Dr. K. Yes, and can we have a contribution by Blessing?
All right, thank you. I want to thank all the presenters, the panelists, and everybody who has spoken so far. For me, I believe that the issues of campaign finance is mostly known by the elite. The regular or rural citizens really do not know much about campaign finance, which is one area I think we can really work on, creating awareness on the impact of campaign finance. Now, a lot of the citizens do not believe in the politicians because these politicians have actually failed in their campaign promises. So they feel the period of campaign and period of election is one way in which they can benefit. So most times they believe they have to make the money from these politicians, because when these politicians get to those positions, they forget them and forget their campaign promises. So most of them look up to these election periods as an opportunity for them to make money. So talking to them about the impact of campaign finance on governance will really bring a lot of impact. And again, if we can have our electoral laws functioning, I take, for example, the case of Nigeria, just like Mr. Feso said, the load on INEC to be able to track campaign finance is very heavy. They do not have the manpower and the finances to carry out this tracking. And again, prosecuting offenders, again, it's another way I feel we can use to deter these menace, because by the time those offenders are not being persecuted, then how do you convince the citizens to believe in tracking campaign finances? And again, the penalties that are being given to these offenders are really nothing to write home about. Just like Mr. Feso said, the law says an individual cannot contribute more than 50 million naira. And if you do that, the offense is for you to pay a fine of 1 million naira, which is like nothing to them. So the citizens do not believe that these offenders are being punished, and then the politicians are also not keeping to their campaign promises. So they see that as an opportunity for them to make money out of this. So I believe if we can push our legislators or push our electoral laws to ensure that offenders are being persecuted, and also if we can carry more awareness to the rural areas and regular citizens to see the negative impact in which campaign finance is having on governance, I think this will go a long way to help us in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other hands up. I would like now to invite panelists to share their parting shots. I'll start with let's start with Festus. Let's change the order.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. My parting words will be to increase our level of sensitization. I remember in Nigeria when we were training civil society organizations on the need to track campaign finance, majority of them were saying, oh, they never knew these humongous amounts are being spent by politicians. It's actually to show that only very few people know what we talk about campaign finance. And politicians are also hiding under this. And that is why, as it has been agreed, we need to develop a modality around citizens mobilization. It may not be, the results might not be immediate, but in the long run, definitely we'll be seeing the result. So it's actually very good that civil society organizations in our different area of endeavors, we talk about it. Like this conference, when I saw it, it actually caught my attention because campaign finance, we were with Nigeria INEC last month when INEC was saying, we were at a meeting when they were saying campaign finance still remains a very big problem, a very big monster for them, because as it stands now, they just concluded 2023 general election. INEC cannot actually say this is the amount of money being spent by political parties. They will have to agree with the reports they will be presenting to them in the next 6 months. And once they do not have any counter reports to show, they will have to take the political parties' reports hook, line, and sinker. And that is where the problem is. So let's increase our effort. By the time majority are aware of this, like the kind of revolution, so to say, that happened in the just concluded election in Nigeria, shows that when citizens are well fed with right information, definitely they will rise up to take the responsibility. Typical example is what happened in Nigeria election. This will be the first election we'll be having a very strong third party, a very strong one. I believe if efforts are channeled towards citizens too, definitely they will be responding to issues. Thank you very much for giving the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Festus. We could have Dr. K.
Yes. My say is that once again, political finance, this issue has to be set as a matter of public utility, because everything depends on it. If it's not clean, if it's not regulated, then we will all pay the price one day or another. So we are all the hostages of this scheme of dirty money, corruption, and politics. So we really need to increase the level of the debate and include all citizens, as colleagues have already mentioned. But I insist on the fact that we need also to do it regionally as a continent, because otherwise we will always be the ones who are left behind. And I just spoke about a tool, a kind of political scorecard in the chat box. We created it for the upcoming presidential elections in Madagascar, because as we failed, to advocate for the revision of our legal framework for better transparency and the sources of funding of candidates, and we said we need to influence the voters, and we need to make them not to vote for those who don't declare, who don't report the sources of their finance. So we created that grid, this scorecard that you can see a sample. It's just a screenshot in the chat box. Unfortunately, it's in Malagasy language right now, but I will send a translated copy to the ACFIN people so that they can share it with you. We created this, and we are currently campaigning towards citizens to use it. We are educating them, even in all the most remote areas. If people are not literate, then we created as well a video and audio version of this grid. And the goal that we take, it's a crazy challenge, but we ought to try something, we just can't let happen the next elections ruled by big money again. We have to try it. And then we really expect citizens to vote better and vote for ideas, not for money. And then we will see where it brings us. But we want, give up on this dream of reforming the electoral laws in Madagascar. It will happen someday, I'm sure. But let's hope it won't be too late, because our country is already in a scarce situation. But yeah, I would like to thank our colleagues who shared their insights today, because at least we feel less alone in this very complicated situation. And I really encourage you to continue this conversation, and we need to build more collective action and reflection around this very important topic. Thanks a lot for having me today and for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. K. Let's have Derek.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah. If you look at some of these countries that have model campaign financing frameworks, you will notice one thing, that it is not really about the strength in their laws and in their constitutions and their regulatory framework, but about the ethos, the kind of political public understanding, appreciation, and feedback, just the public perception on campaigns. If you look at some of the countries that we look up to that have had campaigns before and elections before, for instance, in the UK and the US, and you look at the public backlash that has come when there's been exposures or reports that a certain candidate has been financed by dirty money or money from, for instance, Russia. And you just look at the kind of public political backlash that those candidates get from, and you come to the understanding that it's not really about how strong our laws are, but how strong our values are. That is why it is very important in my perception, in my opinion, which has also been mentioned by Mule, that we really need to focus on the demand side, which Dr. K has also mentioned. Secondly, there's also an opportunity for us to strengthen other institutions that might have a role in some of these these campaign-related issues that election management bodies. I think we might lose the ball if we want to put all our focus on strengthening our election management bodies to be able to monitor and oversight, when there could be other aspects in this whole area that are not tied to them. For instance, in Kenya, we have an anti-corruption commission, which focuses on issues of anti-corruption. They might be interested, or we might want to work with them to specifically focus on monitoring, investigating, and taking action on proceeds of corruption that are coming into the campaigns. We have illicit financial flows. We have institutions which deal with illicit financial flows. They might be better placed to monitor monies that are coming from foreign sources into the campaigns, into campaigns. We have institutions. We have so many other institutions that that might be in a good place to be part of this conversation. We need not necessarily only focus on election management bodies because of the kind of the overwhelming nature of their work, and during that period they are more focused on preparing for the elections. I think I will leave it at that, but it's been a great pleasure. It's also given me an opportunity to meet some of the people I met quite a number of years ago. Kay, I think it was in 2019, I believe. So it's nice to to meet you again, and also Mule, my colleague in Kenya. Nice to meet here in this platform, and also Henry. We had an engagement last year, I think. My internet failed me, but I think this time it has done justice. But very happy to meet all of you and learn from you and colleagues in Nigeria and other countries. Asante sana.
Thank you, Derek. I would now like to invite Dr. Nsami for your parting shot.
Thank you, Sarah and colleagues. I agree with that has already been proposed by others. I just want to add two to three main issues. One, we need to avoid the seasonalization of campaign financing. Political parties and political candidates are actually part of the broader public sphere, and they should be subjected to the same scrutiny as the rest of public institutions. And that means campaign financing should be seen less of something that takes place within election years, and something that is part of the broader improved scrutiny on political financing rather than just campaign financing, broader political financing. So it should be part of the mainstay of the public financial management discourse, as well as discourse on improved governance. That's one. Two, it's important to keep up it's important to make sure that the discussion on campaign financing or political financing is seen as something which is for everyone. So to de-elitify the discussion on campaign or political financing is a concern for all of us because of the inherent dangers that perverse forces that finances these campaigns and political parties pose to our very own welfare and that of our future generations. And as such, there's a need for the debate to enter into the public realm to make sure that each and every single one of us plays our role as members of the civil society when it comes to awareness raising, when it comes to making sure that we're taking to task the different actors that are actually involved. And third but not least, is the role of civil society, as I've already alluded to. I think we remain key to being agents of change in this particular instance, because let's face it, the very powers that gave us these structures that are currently repressing us are under no pressure to actually change them, because they already know the rents, they already know the benefits that they're actually accruing from from the current status quo. So, and the only way we can actually inflict change is by keeping up the pressure, is by civil society playing its active role as an arbiter and also as a third party that looks at how the state machinery operates. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Msami, for those recommendations and parting shots. And now, Henry, I would like to invite you for both your parting shots, but also closing remarks as our host. And yeah, we will end the meeting after your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. For me, it's really an honor and encouragement that at least Africa is talking about this subject. And of course, there is also agreement that the first line of defense when it comes to us insulating our politics from the vagaries of too much money is legislation. But legislation will not come until citizens rise up and demand. So I think the take home for me is that we need to do more in terms of sensitizing citizens to get on board, because campaign financing, political finance, this has remained for the longest time an elitist issue. And therefore, we should be able to make sure that this doesn't happen. So we will have to work more to ensure that citizens are mobilized. I think today in the digital era, we can run quite a number of explainers, but also to work together as a team. And I think by the end of tomorrow, of course, it's already clear that we need to start working together more in terms of building a coalition on regional level, so that we engage at continental level, but also at regional economic community level to get some of that pressure to bear on our own countries in order for us to do this. So I think we have to do more and continue to be more intentional. For now, let me thank you for having come with us all this way from where we started, and we are still continuing La Luta Continua. Thank you, everybody that has participated in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for joining.
And thank you, the moderator, Sarah. It's been a good moderation. I couldn't have asked for better.
Thank you. Thank you, our distinguished panelists, our participants, our hosts, and it's a goodbye from me. It's been an honor moderating this session. Bye-bye.